Hello and welcome back to Trista's Reading Room. I'm your host, Trista Shea. Today we are looking at the Sanctus Chronicles, The Plague of Tradium by D.P. Liemgruber. After the mysterious disappearance of their parents, the Sanctus children are assigned to the Tradium boarding school, where magic is studied but never truly practiced. Paul discovers a mystic book and his own magical gift which may save the school and his younger siblings' lives. When a deadly plague breaches the castle walls, will his sister Hope use her own unique gifts to save the school, even if her own family must pay the ultimate cost? The Sanctus Chronicles, The Plague of Tradium is a tale full of unique supernatural gifts and the wisdom of great literature that children of all ages will delight in, and the whole family can read together. This book was released in 2022, and it is the first book in the Sanctus Chronicles. Book 2 hasn't been released yet. This is for ages 8 to 15 and does deal with the concept of death. You can find them in all formats on Amazon: paperback, hardback, ebook, and audiobook. Here's a little bit about the author. D.P. Liemgruber is the author of the Sanctus Chronicles, the first in a planned series of middle-grade fantasy novels. It is the ideal read-aloud story for the whole family, and an enchanting solo read for adults who love classics like the Chronicles of Narnia. When he's not writing classic tales, he is teaching at the Three Oaks Christian School in Decatur, Indiana. He lives in the middle of cornfields with the wife of his youth and 5 children. He says that the inspiration for the book was that it was originally an extended bedtime story for their 4 and then 5 children. And you can find the author on his website at dpliemgruber.com. And these links will also be on the website where you can find him and his books. Today I'm going to be reading the first 2 chapters. Chapter 1.
Once again, young Master Paul, I have not required you to make it work, only to do it correctly.
But sir,
look, for example, at young Master Exemplum's work.
Professor Pius continued, walking between the desks and leaving no space for Paul's objections.
His hand aloft, quill properly dipped, and his penmanship immaculate.
He leaned close to Paul's ear and spoke in a stage whisper so loud that Paul winced.
You would do well to emulate him.
But sir, Paul's eyes and tone hardened as he glared at the edge of his desk.
Young Master Exemplum's family has been writing the neatest incantations for centuries, and the Exemplum name is synonymous with a job correctly done. This skill has been passed from father to son for 1,000 years. Long before Master Exemplum was even born, I've come to expect the offspring of his parents would one day grace this classroom, and he would carry on the traditions of his forefathers.
But sir! Paul objected loudly enough to be heard in the hallway, finally drawing Professor Pius from his soliloquy. Though I must admit that Master Exemplum's handwriting surpasses mine, the fact remains that his spells don't work any better. Professor Pius inhaled deeply as the color began to rise in his cheeks. The class dared not drop their quills, but he detected the scratching of dozens of pens had ceased, and students were trying their hardest to see the scene play out from the corner of their eyes. He raised his voice and deepened his tone enough to save the other boys the task of straining their ears, but not so loud as to lose the control suitable to his office.
Young Master Paul, since you, a wisp of a boy only 12 years old, see fit to make your voice familiar to the rest of the class, would you please rise and recite from our text?
Paul rose promptly, jerked at his robes, closed his eyes, and took 3 deep breaths. He picked up the tome resting on his desk. Without even opening a book, Professor Pius turned his nose toward the far corner of the ceiling and spoke.
If it suits you, turn to page 7 and read from the 3rd line of the 2nd paragraph.
After generations of teaching from this text, Pius's own copy, several printings earlier than the one the students possessed, was gathering dust on the shelf in his office. Paul traced down page 7 with his finger and growled bitterly into his book.
The art of inscribing incantations, he began.
Professor Pius cut across him.
Young Master Paul, your tongue is sloppier than your quill. You are no more to mumble to thin air than you are to blot upon the page. Both will stain your parchment, and your standing in my classroom. Now, with a voice crisp and clear, address the class you so impertinently insist on interrupting."
All quills were down now, the students having been given full permission to gawk at the scene before them with each rising tone in Professor Pius's voice. "The art of inscribing incantations," Paul began, squeezing his fists in defiance, "is primarily concerned with beauty, and secondarily concerned with accuracy, in the service of the proud tradition of the centuries." Paul took another breath to continue in the resuscitation, but he was not to endure his public reading for more than a sentence.
"Young Master Paul," Professor Pius intoned, "do you recall the word work in the sentence you read for the class?"
"Sir?"
"I assume with your extraordinary mental acuity, you could remember the words in a single sentence."
Paul's eyes dropped to the page, not to reread the sentence, but for an excuse to escape the professor's gaze. "No, sir."
"No, sir, what?"
"No, sir, the word work does not appear in the sentence." Professor Pius stopped his slow prowl around the classroom with his back to the students. After a moment, he exhaled, the tension visibly leaving his shoulders. He turned, his expression the nearest to a smile he could manage. He addressed the wall somewhere over the heads of the students in the back of the classroom.
"This class, inscribing incantations, is about the beauty of your penmanship and the accuracy of the words on the page. I am entirely unconcerned about whether or not these spells—"
He paused, glancing at Paul's isolated desk in the corner of the hall.
"Work. As was so crassly articulated, these spells have been written in an even hand, word for word, for ages long forgotten, and I will continue to educate my students properly so every letter is in its right place, and every word as legible as it has been for centuries."
Professor Pius had worked to the other side of the hall, so Paul allowed himself the liberty of mumbling commentary. "What does it matter if Master Exemplum's writing is legible, when he can't even read?" Although his calculations about Professor Pius's hearing were accurate, in his foul mood he had forgotten about the excellent hearing of Master Exemplum. His hand shot into the air, and Paul's heart did the same.
"Yes, Master Exemplum."
"Young Master Paul," Master Exemplum began. Several boys gasped and covered their mouths. Students never addressed peers by given names in open class, but the professor's earlier tone had emboldened him to address Paul as such, as well as interrupt the proceedings. "Young Master Paul said that my handwriting doesn't matter if I can't read." Paul's worry turned to clutching fear, as Professor Pius did something unknown in the living memory of the school. He shouted. His voice was at once frail with age and shrill with rage.
"It does not matter if he can read them or not. These incantations are to be written, not read. To the headmaster with you."
Chapter 2. Paul could hear his blood pumping in his ears as he stormed out of the hall. The walk to the headmaster's study was long, but Paul's heart continued racing as though he was still fighting with Professor Pius. He must slow his heart and temper enough to appear obedient and repentant before the headmaster. Paul resented that he could not control his body with his mind, and hoped that he may calm himself before he got another meeting with the headmaster. As he opened the door to the assistant's office that guarded the headmaster's study, he saw the malevolent gaze of Mrs. Remorum. Although Mrs. Remorum spent her time waiting for someone to talk to, she relished it most when someone entered that she could talk about. This was not Paul's first time here, and although his eyes did not rise to meet her hungry gaze, he knew she tracked his posture and expression to figure out what trouble he was in. Were he her own child, she would have described him as handsome and fair, with golden hair and curious eyes the color of blueberries. As a threat to school order, however, she thought he was shallow, gaunt, and awkwardly tall, with an unhealthy aversion to look adults in the eye. As Paul sat in his usual chair, his heart gradually slowed, and his general anxiety turned to specific questions. What could happen to him at this point that was worse than what had already occurred? He was out of his inscription class, which was often what he was thinking about anyway at this hour. What could the headmaster do to make things worse? Time ticked by and Paul's mind drifted as it normally would, but now without the burden of paying attention to a professor. He had been in this room often enough to draw it from memory with an impressive level of detail. Paul started to wonder about the portraits of previous headmasters that hung on the walls. Many of them were in storage, because he couldn't fit all 265 pictures in one room. 266 if you counted the work in progress. There were only ever 81 names. Their current headmaster, Professor Arrow, was Arrow the 12th. The same thing was true of other professors at the school, including the man responsible for sending him here today. Going through the list of headmaster names, Paul remembered that there had also been 12 headmasters named Pius. He wondered if Professor Pius wanted to be headmaster, or if the change in routine would be too much for the man to handle after he had taught the inscriptions class for generations. Other students didn't care about numbers or history like Paul. They only cared about their grades. Whenever he would bring up interesting things that began with Y, his classmates quit responding because they knew it would only lead to another question. As Paul continued further in his thoughts, the office and Mrs. Remorum faded from his mind, and soon Paul faded as well. He was woken up by a grip like talons on his shoulder, which he brushed off instinctively. Mrs. Remorum was offended by Paul's awakening swipe, but soon realized more pleasure from an additional offense to report. She marched Paul into Headmaster Arrow's office and gleefully told him what happened in the classroom, as well as how Paul had pretended to sleep, only to violently ambush her only moments before. She was not shy in suggesting minimum punishments for both of these crimes. Her relish in suggesting ways to violently discipline students had only grown since noticing that the great Headmaster Arrow was lamentably slow in coming to conclusions on his own. She stood in the doorway, waiting for his decision, but was disappointed to hear his sleepy voice dismiss her with a thank you so flat, she was sure he had not been paying attention. She left with a smile full of venom and an ear pressed to the door. Paul stood in front of the headmaster, as unsure of what would happen next, as was Headmaster Arrow himself. The professor had to do a great deal of work to earn his position, but once he had attained it, no more work was required of him. It was strange at first. His nervous energy bent on pleasing his superiors had no more purpose when he had ceased to have superiors to please. His rare meetings with the Board of Trustees were kept purely for the sake of tradition. The board would only fire him for the most extreme disaster. His youth and health had been spent to buy his esteemed position of chair, and now there was nothing left to do but sit in it. He did not rise from it now.
Master Sanctus,
he began, and did not know where to finish. He was uneasy seeing this boy standing at attention. He was expected to do something about this youth in his office, and he felt rushed with the boy standing alertly before him. He offered a seat, not out of courtesy, but because it slowed the rate of expectation. They sat together in silence long enough to drive Mrs. Remorum away from her post on the other side of the door and calm both of their nerves. In the silence, they both began to consider the same question.
Master Sanctus, do you know why you are here?
Paul remained silent and locked his eyes onto a floorboard in need of repair. If Headmaster Arrow did not remember what he had been told, Paul was not going to remind him. The hanging silence was uncomfortable at first, but eventually they came to a mutual understanding that the meeting was keeping the both of them from more troubling matters involving people that insisted on two-sided conversations. They listened to the crackling in the grate, and Paul watched appreciatively as the headmaster added new logs and stacked the fire with care. It was one of the few things left in his day that gave him a sense of purpose and accomplishment, so he approached it as a sacred art. When the headmaster returned to his seat, he was startled by the boy's gaze. Paul's eyes finally met the headmaster's bespectacled face with a familiarity that bordered on friendship. None of Paul's professors or classmates had seen this look before, and it caught the headmaster off guard. Maybe it was the rarity and sincerity that brought Professor Arrow to repeat the question, with an entirely different meaning.
Paul, do you know why you are here?
Although the question was the same, Professor Arrow was now genuinely curious. The boy was thoughtful, unlike most of the other students who stayed out of trouble by following all school rules without thought. It was an odd quality, and the headmaster was spellbound and anxious to explore it. Paul noticed the change in address. The headmaster was not using his first name in the same way Professor Pius used it to cut him down, but in a friendly way. Paul wanted to explore the true meaning of the question, so he tentatively asked, "At school, sir?" Professor Arrow was glad that he and the boy were walking the same path, and tried to narrow the lane.
I mean at this school in particular. When your parents died, my boy.
He attempted a comforting smile.
They left a great deal of money, along with instructions to send you and your siblings to, and I quote, Scriptum, the greatest and most prestigious boarding school in the country. End quote. The difficulty the state had in fulfilling the legal requirements of the will could not have been stranger in timing. The very day of your parents' demise, the state revoked the license of Scriptum Boarding School, and the professors fled into hiding out of fear of arrest. So, strictly following your parents' will was impossible. However, by simply ignoring one word of their wishes, the state was able to fulfill them, and you were sent here to, and I quote, the greatest and most prestigious boarding school in the country, Tradium Boarding School.
Professor Arrow had kept his eyes level with Paul's throughout the conversation, and until he had just now paused, the eye contact had been maintained. Now both sensed that this was enough to process for the boy, as he pretended to return his interest to the floorboard in need of repair.
That will be all, Master Sanctus.
This was all Paul needed to hear to retreat to his dormitory. His mind was so full with this news that he had entirely forgotten about the trouble he was supposed to be in, for inciting that legible thing should be read, and incantations should work. That's it for the Sanctus Chronicles today. Let me know if you want to hear more of that on Trista's Reading Room, and thanks for joining me.